It is now my pleasure to bring up the next speaker. He's investment principal at ConsenSys. He's going to be talking to us about debt-based finance. This is Praneeth Srikanti. Praneeth, you can just share your screen and open your camera up whenever you feel ready. The floor is yours.
Awesome, cool. Very glad to meet you all. And yeah, when Eden first spoke about organizing CSCON as an event where people would be sharing knowledge and would actually use that as a basis to kind of build a better understanding of the ecosystem that ConsenSys has kind of been cultivating. I thought this was perfect. Just wondering how best to kind of position myself as in terms of the content that I was presenting, but hopefully this session might just be helpful in provoking a few thoughts, and would actually love to hear your feedback on a few thoughts that I've been having in these directions. And so so I just decided to let me know if you can see what I'm sharing. Am I, or is that visible or not? I'm not sure if that is the case, but I suppose it is. So let's probably go ahead. But just to kind of give a brief introduction, so I'm with ConsenSys Labs in the venture investment unit in ConsenSys, and we are an early stage investment firm backing projects in the Web3 space that are looking to scale and bring more adoption in general, and are also very proud investors in ChainSafe, and I'm a huge supporter of the work that they've been doing to date. As part of that, I wanted to start thinking about the nature of financing that we typically use in early projects in the Web3 space, in the Web2 space, and really start thinking about why we've been having more equity-like notions of financing that we typically associate, be it with governance or with the notion of economics that kind of flow down to some part of the native tokens that each project typically embodies. And maybe starting to switch gears and think about why are we not using debt financing, and can we kind of do something along those lines which can potentially get us in a shape to use this construct. So the primary, I guess the important thing to realize is that debt as itself has been primarily a social construct. So starting from even 5,000 years back in the Sumerian civilization or in the Indus Valley civilization, what really happened was commerce and events like taxation were really obligations between different parties of creditors and debtors. And these obligations were recorded in the form of these wooden tally sticks or these ivory blocks. And these were essentially the first expressions or a form of debt that was kind of used prior to even things like cash and barter systems. And these slowly became more negotiable instruments which could function as money in some context. And so modern monetary theory does kind of speak about how a lot of money that we see today is essentially an expression of a denomination of debt or credit in some sense. And that is really what we've migrated to since the Nixon shock in '71 in some aspect. And so and there's actually a very fascinating paper by an economist, Barry Merlin, who kind of suggests, I mean, this has been suggested before about how money and credit have been interchangeable, but he kind of presents this in the notion of having a hierarchy of assets, and starting to think about those as, I guess, central bank issued, should we say, fiat in some aspect, sitting at the second rung below asset-backed securities in some aspect, like gold. And then you kind of have deposits in banks, and then you kind of have securities. And the lower down the stack you end up going, I guess the more money actually starts looking like an obligation, so to speak. And I guess, I mean, it's something that is so fundamental to people to have these obligations, and it's so easy to construct that the notion of equity only really came about in the Middle Ages. I think with equity laws in in England that were kind of backed to provide land-based financing and whatnot. And so debt financing at its core is really an obligation. It's an obligation to kind of to another party about, and in most cases it typically has to deal with capital in some regards, some principle that was owed to a debtor. And the terms that you associate with that condition in terms of how you pay back this capital, how much more you kind of pay back on the same, and within which duration you kind of do this. And so for people who are creditors, the things that they look at are things along the lines of creditworthiness, whether the person I'm entering into this kind of relationship has the capability to get me back the capital that was owed, and use that also as a basis to think about the exposure or the level of risk that they would be taking on as part of their own assets or their own on their own book, so to speak, when you have the notion of wherein you have the notion of whether this instrument itself is securitizable or whether it is tokenizable in some aspect. And I could shift it off my own sheet to maybe another investor who wants exposure in the same. But at the core of all this, the key thing to think about is that debt is something that is very easy to codify. As long as you have an agreement between different parties, it's super simple to kind of to reach consensus on in some aspect, and this actually leads to a very, very simple way of structuring this. But thanks to this very simplicity that is encoded in the parameterization, you also kind of have a lot of complexity that that ensures in the kind of debt that could be that could be available on market at any given point. And so I think this was actually a diagram that was released by the US Fed at some point, just speaking about all of the kinds of debt that was typically associated within the US economy at a given point, which obviously is in the trillions of dollars, if anything. And I guess a funny example is to actually think about a point in time where Apple only had one class of shares, if one might call it that, but they actually had 24 different types of corporate bonds, which kind of represent essentially debt obligations with different repayment terms, with different yields and whatnot. So, and they kind of were created to accommodate different purposes that the company had, but also to kind of accommodate the interest of people who had different preference functions in terms of the amount of exposure they wanted to these kinds of instruments in some regard. But I guess in some sense, if we kind of look at, I guess this the notion of the world as it is in some sense, what we're seeing is that there's a lot more direct to retail offerings that are happening, not just in the web. I mean, in the broader context of the financial world, there are a lot more direct to retail offerings, and we're seeing a lot of increased participation from entities and people who were not traditionally accounted for in the financial system that was kind of built up in the mid 70s and the 80s. And so a very interesting example actually being a government in Asia giving citizens the access to tokenized bonds that people could essentially end up buying on their mobile phone. And this was thanks to the notion that other players in the financial system were maybe already overburdened by things that prevented them to kind of take on this additional exposure. And we've kind of seen this trickle also in the Web3 space, where we've obviously seen throughout the years an incident, I guess, a large number of, I guess, token generation events, which we're kind of continuing to see to date in different forms. But the one thing that we're really conflating here is the notion of control in the form of governance, and the notion of economics in terms of the expected outcome that people associate with their investment. And so any form of debt financing in the real world has seen a huge amount of institutional participation, we're still not at that point in the Web3 space. What we're really seeing is only, I guess, retail participation in kind of getting access to leverage positions and potentially using that as a basis to boost their returns. But the question that I was thinking about is, why are teams of developers who are working on new features not kind of tapping into this new form of financing, one which is potentially non-dilutive, one which could be a lot more simple to express and potentially have the tastes of investors in these forms of instruments, the taste of LPs accommodated in a much better fashion, as opposed to people who kind of like come in for a very short-term exposure and don't really have the notion of long-term capital that you need to associate with something that has more of an equity-like nature. And before I kind of delve into some brief ideas, I just wanted to actually think about all of the all of the advantages that debt typically brings, which really has these 5 core pillars that I've just kind of been speaking or referring through, and will be doing so throughout the rest of this session. The first is obviously in the simplicity that it offers in terms of how it is structured. The second aspect that I wanted to touch upon was a very interesting one, which essentially was the separation of economic and governance preferences in terms of the capability of having different people care about different things and having the capability for protocols and projects to express that in a way that was easily attributable and also kind of more transparent in terms of what this could provide. So there's different people and different entities who kind of care about the health of an ecosystem as it grows. Some of them are in it with less of a risk appetite and kind of care about more of a stable return on a specific activity that the protocol might be choosing to do. And there might be others who want to be, so to speak, long in on every aspect that the ecosystem or this protocol really concerns. And so that's maybe a simplistic way of looking at it, but that's one way of kind of thinking about the separation of those concerns. The third is something that is very positive, and which is essentially the emergence of attributable cash flows on chain, and also the capability for increased transparency that you typically see in these systems, where you can kind of track assets as they are used and spent to drive specific outcomes in these kinds of systems. And so this is a really neat way to kind of capture some part of that and build a better system of financing than what we've typically seen in the real world, and all of the shortcomings that it typically has. The fourth and the fifth are typically are more related to the notion of maybe comfort that people have with encoding debt in systems that they've used before. So you can kind of think about tokenizing debt and potentially integrating that with RFQ-based systems, or even some of the more interesting and newer AMM-based or rate-centric AMM models that are coming and being developed by teams like Yield and Notional in some aspect. But this is really a much neater and a nicer way to start thinking about providing flexibility and automation to forms of financing that I think is a crucial step that differentiates maybe Web3 from the way we've kind of done things in the world before. And so coming to the actual mechanics, I guess, I mean, this would probably just function almost very simply like a loan that you might kind of see on Aave or Compound right now, where you kind of have the capability to use or dedicate some part of the native tokens or the governance tokens that you typically have at the lowest layer, on the lowest preference layer, so to speak, as collateral against and offering this as a basis to create tokenizable LP positions in tranches of debt over that. But the key difference here would be that the notion of raising interest from LPs would actually be suited or would actually be driven towards achieving a particular outcome. And so maybe you can start thinking about the same, some of the recent activity in the DeFi space where you've seen teams like Lion essentially merge with teams from Cream and Pickle. So M&A could typically be an activity that might be responsible or used for creating a specific financing vehicle for the company to act upon. Or you could maybe start thinking about the notion where you kind of want to use this capital to drive or develop a certain set of product features that might enable better outcomes for the protocol in general, but also for the features that would actually be developed in these cases. Or maybe you could actually start thinking about doing a much more better or targeted user acquisition strategy, as opposed to kind of diluting yourself and kind of giving away a lot of the important governance tokens to ecosystem participants, and kind of diluting yourself, especially in the early stages of the program, when there might essentially be a need to kind of have more tightly guided outcomes in some aspect. But the idea would then kind of be to have these specific outcomes kind of codified, and also have these encoded as benchmarks or milestones that kind of need to be met, and use that as a basis to kind of get or attract LPs who would kind of fund these new vehicles, and use that as a basis to actually embark on these activities. And so, if, for instance, I choose to do an M&A with this capital that I raise, maybe some of the benchmarks that I want to choose to look at would be like code commits from a certain set of developers across the ecosystem of repositories that I'm using, and use that as one of the criteria that I need to fulfill in order to actually get access to the capital that LPs would deposit in this tranche. And so the idea would still be that you would have some notion of a payout where all of the activity that you're driving towards is ultimately going to result in an increased value creation in some cost, in some basis or the other, where it could essentially end up in reduced coordination costs. It could typically have better take rates for the protocol, or the features that are kind of being developed. And what you can then kind of think about is essentially allocating preferentially these flows that come from these particular activities to the financiers or the LP interests in these particular vehicles. And if these activities don't pan out the way that they are supposed to, it kind of gives people or LPs the chance to kind of lay claim to the underlying token to kind of then maybe direct governance for the broader protocol to act in a direction that is more suited for the ecosystem to develop better. And the idea would also be that you could potentially start thinking about splitting or tokenizing governance rights and associate those to these LP interests, where they have a much more stronger say in guiding the outcome of this particular activity that they've been financing, but not having as much of a say in the broader development of the ecosystem and other activities that the ecosystem is kind of embarking upon, and kind of using that as a basis to cleanly segregate and understand people's interest and the interest in governing which part of the ecosystem that they care about. And so the benefits that this really brings are things that I just touched upon. So it's primarily capital efficiency, but it kind of fulfills needs for teams kind of embarking and working in a way that is much more fluid and kind of could drive more working capital needs for the same. It's non-dilute. It's obviously non-dilutive. It's much better for people who obviously are long-term believers in the growth of an ecosystem and want to kind of reap the benefits of participating from the same. And so the idea is that once we kind of have these notions in place, it actually lends itself to a much better understanding of the real cost of capital that we're kind of seeing in these teams in terms of what a team really needs in a Web3 in a crypto native Web3 ecosystem to kind of build and iterate upon a feature and show that it could actually lead to value accrual to not just that product or feature that is kind of being built, but also towards the ecosystem as a whole, and kind of then using that as a basis to not just expand upon the fixed pool of governance tokens that you kind of have, but then using that as a basis to kind of tap into other forms of financing, like which some of which could essentially be structured as a debt-based offering. And all of this typically begs the question as to whether we are at a point for using such structures. I'd say the short answer is no in some cases, but there are a lot of very, very encouraging signs that I kind of touched upon before in the form of some protocols actually having attributable on-chain cash flows. And we're also kind of seeing notions in the space around consolidation for talent, for assets and liquidity, for the different kinds of services that you might essentially need to be offering to your customers at one point. And so, and all of this actually lends itself to a much neater outcome in terms of showcasing showcasing firstly transparency in your operations, and also kind of thinking really hard about the notion of enabling people to have a clear separation of concerns in terms of the core levers of economics and control. And this also kind of lends itself very, very neatly to the notion of having different kinds of tranches or different kinds of exposure and backstops given you know the inherent risk in kind of developing new features that a particular ecosystem sees on a daily basis. Pretty sure you're aware of all of the issues that kind of come up with increasing the surface area of smart contracts, or even some part of the backend infrastructure that you associate with the same. And so this might potentially be a neater way to contain some part of those risks. Although I guess we'll really have to see if this kind of pans out. But I'd say that we are in the nascent stages of kind of getting to these systems. And so it's going to be very, very nice to actually see teams iterate upon some of these notions and actually see if they can attract interest from different stakeholders in this space. I guess I probably need to also mention the role of other intermediaries and stakeholders in all of these processes, where you really need to have, I guess, the notion of credit facilities and protocols who are obviously willing to underwrite and lend capital against newer forms of reserves. And so, and this would have to ensure that it's not just assets that are new or have been around for a while, but also taking into account protocols and needs of developers who are newer to the ecosystem, and taking on the capability of underwriting the offering with their own reserves and with a few backstops set in place. The other thing that we really need is getting a lot of education and ensuring that there is a right distribution for these kinds of assets, and making sure that they find their way to the right kinds of people in some regard. So with you kind of have now at your control a capability to parameterize a lot of things that people might choose to care about, given time preference, given governance preference, given economic outcomes. And so you kind of have the capability to do this in a much better fashion. And so if we start using that in a much better way, I think there's going to be an interesting outcome that could typically be involved for multiple stakeholders. And you obviously need more liquid markets to ensure that there is treatability and you don't associate like a steep liquidity discount. And you also need better analytic tooling for attribution of cash flows and also getting an account of the spends that protocol teams have been doing towards these particular outcomes. And most importantly, one of the things that's missing right now is the lack of what one might call a risk-free rate in the market, and also kind of thinking about things that could ultimately act as a backstop in the same way that I guess a U.S. Treasury bond does in some regard. And so we still need to kind of get to that point. Staking-based derivatives might do that. We might also get to more interesting risk-free rates through the utilization of state channels, be it in terms of the Lightning networks or the Lightning pool, or in the form of what Connext is building with their vector framework to kind of allow for inter-layer 2, layer 1 interoperability and expressing or allowing liquidity providers to kind of have an inherent cost of capital that they have or need to actually provide the capability to transition funds from one ecosystem to another. But really, I think this notion is still pretty untested, and this might go well, this might not. So we kind of need to see if there is a market demand and how we can actually start thinking about building up something along those lines. But I think if we do get there, I think it's going to be super interesting, because we actually have the capability to form newer forms of better credit facilities and building up a much more transparent and much better rating system in that regard, as opposed to what one might see in the existing financial setup. We actually now have the capability to tap into multiple forms of risk-free rates that are slowly coming up. Similar to IBOR, we could have an ILOR. And I guess the most interesting thing is that we now potentially have the capability to offer newer forms of structured products, things that are much easier for people to understand and kind of directly use, and thereby widening the capital base of people who are participants in the ecosystem, and actually giving them things that they are comfortable being exposed to in some sense. And so that is something that I feel is a very exciting notion of how people can work in a more crypto native, in a new open interoperable web, thanks to the notion of a uniform settlement layer that kind of serves as the base truth for all of this. But yeah, with that, I think I'm pretty much done with what I had to ramble about, and I'm happy to kind of get to answer any questions, or just actually have people reach out if they have any concerns. So
great. Well, thank you very much, Praneeth. I feel like that was a lot of information.
Sorry, I can't seem to hear you, Cindy, but I'm not sure if that's an issue on my phone.
Can you guys hear me?
Okay, cool. I could hear you, Cindy, but for some reason you two aren't connecting to one another. So I can just ask the questions, if you don't mind, that we have here.
Go on.
Awesome. So firstly, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate kind of the perspective that maybe people aren't bringing to the space, which is kind of coming with a more well-rounded approach to how these things will get funded in the future. So to ask you the question, if you could disrupt any industry outside of blockchain with more transparent and flexible debt-based financing, which one would you pick and why?
Any industry outside blockchain? Huh. That's going to be an interesting one, I think. I'd probably have to look at. I'd probably have to go back to some part of the to where I actually hail from, and start thinking about some part of the issues and the market issues that we typically see funding a few cooperative structures back home in India, which is where I hail from in some regard, where it typically gets very hard for some part of these cooperative structures to kind of tap into forms of credit-based financing outside of government funding, thanks to the notion that it's really hard to kind of actually get more data about these structures, although they actually end up being things that are actually pretty good in terms of ensuring livelihood for people, ensuring that processes are actually done in a way that's much more environmentally friendly. And so it's a pity that it's only government backed, but I think forms of credit financing would actually be super helpful for something along those lines. But
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that insight, and hopefully, these different things can align and then help fuel one another soon. Thank you so much for joining us today, Praneeth.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Talk soon.